The rain lashed against the windows of Ashford Manor with such ferocity that the glass trembled in its ancient frames, and within the mahogany-panelled study, two men sat across from one another in a silence, broken only by the scratch of pen against parchment and the occasional crack of thunder that rolled across the Yorkshire moors like divine judgment. Marcus Ashford watched Lord Edmund Hartley's hand move across the marriage contract with the detached interest of a man observing a particularly efficient execution, his own fingers steady as they had been when he'd signed away a significant portion of his fortune mere moments before. Because this was not a transaction of the heart but of the ledger, a carefully calculated exchange that would bind Hartley's daughter to him in matrimony and Hartley himself to a debt that could never be fully repaid. The candlelight caught the silver in Hartley's temples, painted shadows beneath his jowls, revealed the slight tremor in his grip that spoke of a man who knew he was surrendering something precious to settle accounts he could no longer avoid, and Marcus felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of watching an enemy capitulate. Catherine Hartley, the name, appeared on the documents between them, rendered in formal script. A legal entity rather than a living woman was barely mentioned in their brief, businesslike conversation. She was 23 years old, educated in the manner expected of her station, possessed of adequate health and acceptable breeding, and these facts were recited with the same inflection one might use to describe a mare being sold at auction. Marcus had seen her once, 2 years prior, at a charitable function, a pale slip of a girl in an unfortunate shade of lavender who had stood at the edges of the ballroom like a ghost, uncertain of her right to haunt, and he had noted her existence with the same attention he might give to wallpaper. She was not the object of his vengeance. She was merely the vessel through which it would flow, the means by which Edmund Hartley would suffer as Marcus's own father had suffered when Hartley's manipulations had destroyed the Ashford shipping enterprise and driven a good man to put a pistol to his temple in this very room. 20 years ago, the memory of finding his father's body lived in Marcus still, a wound that had never healed, but had instead calcified into something harder and more enduring than grief, a purpose that had shaped every decision, every business acquisition, every carefully constructed step that had brought him to this moment of absolute power over the man responsible. Hartley signed the final page, set down the pen with hands that shook more noticeably now, and looked up with eyes that held a father's anguish poorly concealed beneath aristocratic pride. "She is a good girl," Hartley said, his voice rough. "She will be a dutiful wife." Marcus met his gaze with eyes like winter ice and offered nothing. No reassurance, no kindness, no promise of tender treatment. Because this marriage was not about Catherine Hartley's happiness or Edmund Hartley's peace of mind. It was about justice, delayed but not forgotten, about the systematic dismantling of the man who had destroyed everything Marcus had once held dear. And if an innocent girl became collateral damage in that destruction, well, innocence had never protected anyone from the consequences of their father's sins. The chapel bells rang across the estate grounds 3 weeks later, with a clarity that seemed almost mocking, given the somber nature of the ceremony they announced, and Marcus stood at the altar in the small stone church that had witnessed generations of Ashford unions. Most of them, he imagined bitterly, entered into with more affection than this, watching the heavy oak doors at the far end of the aisle, with the same expression he might wear while awaiting the delivery of contracted goods. The church was nearly empty, populated only by the witnesses required by law and custom. His solicitor, a handful of household staff, Lord Hartley looking grey and diminished in the front pew, and the vicar whose practised neutrality could not quite mask his discomfort at officiating a marriage that felt more like a funeral. Then the doors opened, and Catherine appeared, a figure in ivory silk that seemed to drain what little colour she possessed until she looked like something carved from alabaster, her dark hair arranged in elaborate coils that only emphasized the pallor of her skin and the shadows beneath her eyes. She moved down the aisle with her father's hand beneath her elbow, though Hartley's grip seemed more like restraint than support, and Marcus found himself noticing details he had not anticipated, the way her wedding dress, though expertly tailored, hung slightly loose on her frame as though made for someone with more substance, the trembling of her hands where they clutched a bouquet of white roses, the downward cast of her gaze that never once lifted to meet his own. She was, he realized, with something approaching surprise, beautiful not in the bold, eye-catching manner of women who commanded ballrooms, but in a fragile, ethereal way that made one think of watercolors left too long in the rain, of hothouse flowers unlikely to survive a harsh wind. When she reached the altar, and her father released her with what might have been relief or regret, Marcus neither knew nor cared. She finally raised her eyes, and he saw in them something that struck him more forcefully than her unexpected beauty: absolute resignation. This was a woman who expected nothing, hoped for nothing, had been thoroughly taught that her purpose was to be ornamental and obedient, and to ask for no warmth in return. The vicar began the ceremony, his voice echoing in the cold space, and Marcus spoke his vows in clear, firm tones that gave no hint of the transaction underlying them. But when Catherine's turn came, her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, the words, "I do," so soft that the vicar had to lean closer to hear them, and Marcus noticed that her hands trembled so violently the roses shook, petals drifting to the stone floor like tears she would not shed. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his mother's ring, chosen not for sentiment, but because it was expected, and felt the coldness of her skin, the delicacy of bones that seemed as though they might break beneath the slightest pressure. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Marcus lifted her veil with hands that were steady while hers were not, and he kissed her cheek with the perfunctory brevity of a man fulfilling an obligation, tasting salt there though her eyes remained dry. As they turned to face the sparse congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, Catherine's expression remained unchanged, that same quiet acceptance, that same terrible dignity, and Marcus thought, with the small part of his mind not consumed by satisfaction at Hartley's evident anguish, that she looked less like a bride than a prisoner being led to a cell she had known all along awaited her. The first weeks of their marriage unfolded in a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and texture, filling the corridors of Ashford Manor like invisible fog, and Catherine moved through the vast estate with the insubstantial quality of something not quite real, a pale figure in muted colors who appeared at mealtimes when summoned and otherwise existed in spaces Marcus did not occupy, as though she had learned through some instinct of self-preservation to make herself as unobtrusive as possible in a home where she was not wanted. The house itself seemed designed to enforce their separation, a monument to cold perfection, with its marble floors that echoed footsteps into accusations, its high ceilings that swallowed warmth, its endless rooms filled with furniture too fine to be comfortable and art too valuable to be loved, each space immaculately maintained by servants who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that their master preferred order to humanity. Marcus had chosen separate bedrooms, citing his irregular hours and desire not to disturb her rest, though they both understood it was another wall between them, and Catherine had accepted this arrangement with the same silent acquiescence she brought to everything, nodding once and retreating to the suite of rooms designated as hers, a collection of chambers done in shades of cream and gold that were beautiful and lifeless as a showroom. He saw her primarily at dinner. When convention demanded, they sit at opposite ends of an absurdly long table and consume courses prepared by his French chef while speaking only when necessary, their conversations limited to observations about the weather or brief responses to questions asked from obligation rather than interest. And even these exchanges were marked by her careful deference, the way she never contradicted him or offered opinions unless directly solicited, the manner in which she seemed to make herself smaller in his presence, as though apologizing for existing at all. During the day, Marcus occupied himself with business matters in his study or rode out to inspect his various holdings, and he neither knew nor cared how Catherine spent her hours, until one afternoon, when business had brought him home earlier than usual, and he had glimpsed her through a window, kneeling in the garden with dirt on her hands and her hair escaping its pins, tending to the roses that had grown wild during the estate's period without a mistress. And there had been something in her posture, a loosening of the tension she carried everywhere else, a softness in her expression as she touched the petals that had struck him as somehow improper, as though she were revealing something private he had no right to witness. She never asked him for anything, and this fact registered with Marcus gradually, becoming more notable as the days accumulated. Into weeks she made no requests for pin money beyond the modest allowance his solicitor provided, expressed no desire to redecorate or entertain or visit London, seemed content or at least resigned to exist in this beautiful prison with only the servants and her gardens for company, and he told himself he was grateful for her lack of demands, even as some part of him, small and easily ignored, wondered what kind of life had taught her to expect so little that his cold indifference seemed acceptable. The library had become Marcus's sanctuary within his own home, the one room where he allowed himself to be something other than the calculating industrialist or the coldly distant husband, and it was here he retreated on a Tuesday evening in late September after a particularly trying day of negotiations, seeking the comfort of leather-bound volumes and the familiar smell of old paper and tobacco, only to find upon entering that the room was already occupied. Catherine stood before the shelves near the window, where the last of the daylight fell in amber shafts. So absorbed in the book, she held that she didn't hear his entrance, and for a moment Marcus simply watched her, noting the way she touched the pages with a gentleness that suggested reverence, the slight furrow between her brows that spoke of concentration, the manner in which she tucked herself into the window seat, with her shoes abandoned on the floor and her legs curled beneath her in a posture of unself-conscious comfort he had never seen her adopt in his presence. When he cleared his throat, she startled so violently, the book nearly tumbled from her hands, and the transformation was immediate and painful, to witness the softness vanishing from her expression as she uncurled herself and stood, smoothing her skirts with trembling fingers, the book clutched against her chest like a shield. "Forgive me," she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of apology that had become her constant refrain. "I didn't know you would be here. I should have asked permission before." But Marcus, surprising himself, raised a hand to stop her, suddenly weary of her endless contrition, of the way she apologized for occupying space in what was ostensibly her own home. "What are you reading?" he asked, more curious than he wanted to admit, and she glanced down at the volume as though she'd forgotten she held it, then extended it toward him with the careful movements of someone returning a precious artifact to its rightful owner. It was Wordsworth, he saw, a collection of poetry he had acquired years ago and barely remembered owning. "I found it while looking for something to read in my rooms," Catherine explained quietly. "The romantics have always, that is, I've always found comfort in," she trailed off, clearly uncertain how much of herself it was safe to reveal, but Marcus found himself genuinely interested, something shifting in his perception as he realized he had made the same assumption about her that everyone made about beautiful, ornamental women, and that the exterior was all there was. "You have studied poetry, then?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral, and something flickered in her eyes, perhaps surprise that he would ask, or perhaps hope that he might actually care to know the answer. "My governess believed in a thorough education," she replied, "though my father thought it wasteful to cultivate a mind in someone whose only purpose was to be married well," and there was no bitterness in her voice, only that terrible acceptance that characterized everything about her. But Marcus heard in those words an echo of his own dismissal, his own failure to see anything in her beyond her father's name. Their conversation remained brief, constrained by the unfamiliarity of actually speaking to one another as anything other than polite strangers, and soon Catherine excused herself with another apology, leaving the Wordsworth on the table by the door, and Marcus told himself he was relieved to have his solitude restored, even as his eyes kept drifting to the abandoned volume. Later, after his own reading had failed to hold his attention, he picked up the book she'd been holding and found himself arrested by what he discovered there, in the margins of Tintern Abbey, in a hand so delicate it was almost difficult to read. Catherine had written a single line, but some of us never had the beauty to lose, and Marcus stood in the darkening library, holding this evidence of an inner life he had never bothered to acknowledge, feeling the first unwelcome crack in the armor of his indifference, troubled by the intelligence and melancholy those few words revealed. The delicate loops and flourishes of Catherine's handwriting had triggered something in Marcus that he could not immediately name, a disturbance in the carefully maintained architecture of his hatred, and that night he found himself unable to sleep, lying in the darkness of his chamber, while memories he had kept locked away for decades rose unbidden, like spectres demanding acknowledgement. He was 12 again, standing in the hallway of their modest London townhouse, listening to raised voices from his father's study, not understanding the words bankruptcy and creditors and ruin, but comprehending perfectly the desperation in his father's tone, and then the terrible silence that followed, broken only by his mother's scream when she found Thomas Ashford slumped over his desk with the pistol still in his hand, and a letter beside him that Marcus would later read, would memorize in every devastating detail, a letter that explained how Lord Edmund Hartley had systematically destroyed their shipping business through manipulation and bribery and deliberate sabotage, how debts had been called in early and contracts cancelled and reputation shredded until there was nothing left but shame and death. He remembered his mother after that, how she had aged a decade in a single year, how the light had gone out of her eyes as they sold everything to pay creditors and moved to increasingly smaller lodgings, how she had worked her hands raw taking in sewing and mending, too proud to beg but too broken to truly fight, and how she had died of pneumonia in a freezing garret while Marcus, 16 and helpless, had held her hand and sworn on her deathbed that he would make the Hartleys pay for every moment of suffering they had caused. The vow had sustained him through years of relentless work, through his rise from nothing to wealth that eclipsed even Hartley's fortune, through every calculated step that had led to this moment. Edmund Hartley's beloved daughter, installed in Marcus's home, a living trophy of his revenge, proof that he could take from the man who had taken everything. But now, lying in darkness with the ghost of Catherine's handwriting burned into his mind, Marcus found the satisfaction he had anticipated strangely absent, replaced instead by a growing unease, as the sound of piano music drifted through the house, so unexpected at this late hour that he rose and made his way toward the source, finding himself outside the music room, where light spilled from beneath the door, and Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major flowed with a technical perfection and emotional depth that arrested him completely. Through the partially open door he could see Catherine at the grand piano he had purchased for show and never heard played. Her pale face luminous in the candlelight, her eyes closed as her fingers moved across the keys with the certainty of long practice and genuine artistry. And there was something in her expression, a transport, a transcendence, a momentary escape from whatever prison her life had been, that made Marcus understand, with uncomfortable clarity, that she was not simply Hartley's daughter or his instrument of revenge, but a person entire unto herself, someone with depths he had never bothered to plumb. And watching her play with such beauty while believing herself unobserved, he felt the foundations of his certainty begin to crack beneath the weight of a question he had never thought to ask. What if his revenge was destroying someone who had never been his enemy at all? The disturbance that Catherine's piano playing had created in Marcus's carefully maintained fortress of indifference left him restless and resentful in the days that followed. And so when Mrs. Morrison mentioned that the mistress would be taking dinner in the formal dining room rather than her chambers that Thursday evening, Marcus found himself seized by a perverse impulse to reassert the boundaries of their arrangement and to remind himself and perhaps her of the true nature of their union and the unbridgeable chasm that her father's crimes had created between them. The meal began in their customary silence, Catherine's presence at the far end of the long mahogany table, so distant she might have been in another room entirely. Her movements as she handled her silverware, possessed of that careful grace he had come to recognize as her attempt to make herself as unobtrusive as possible, and Marcus watched her over his wineglass while his mind worked to formulate the words that would restore his certainty, that would crack whatever softness had begun to form in his perception of her. "I had an interesting conversation with Lord Pemberton today," Marcus began, his tone deliberately casual as he cut into his roast, regarding certain business practices that have become common among the older merchant families, the manipulation of contracts, the strategic destruction of competitors through whispered words in the right ears, the sort of calculated cruelty that masquerades as legitimate commerce. He saw Catherine's hand pause fractionally over her plate, saw the slight stiffening of her shoulders that suggested she understood exactly where this conversation was leading, but she said nothing, and her silence emboldened him to continue. "Your father, I'm told, was particularly masterful at such tactics," Marcus pressed on, something almost cruel entering his voice now. "A man who could ruin families with a smile, who considered the suffering of others merely the cost of his own advancement." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation, and Marcus waited for her defense, for the tears or protestations that would allow him to harden his heart against her once more. But when Catherine finally looked up from her plate, her expression held neither anger nor hurt, but only a weariness that seemed to age her beyond her years. "Yes," she said quietly, and the simple acknowledgement struck Marcus with unexpected force. "My father is precisely that sort of man, Mr. Ashford, I have known this since I was old enough to understand the source of our wealth, since I first overheard him laughing with his associates about a merchant who had hanged himself after my father orchestrated his bankruptcy. She set down her fork with hands that trembled slightly, but kept her gaze steady on Marcus's face. I have watched him destroy people for sport, have seen him take pleasure in wielding power over those weaker than himself, have lived my entire life in a house built on the suffering of others. Do you imagine I am unaware of what he is, of what sins I carry by association with his name? There was no defensiveness in her tone, no attempt to excuse or minimize, only a terrible acceptance that somehow wounded Marcus more than any protestation of innocence could have done. I cannot defend him, Catherine continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. I will not insult your intelligence or my own integrity by pretending that Edmund Hartley is anything other than cruel and grasping and utterly without conscience. I have spent my life being ashamed of bearing his name, of benefiting from wealth accumulated through the ruin of good people, and if you have brought me here to punish me for his crimes, then I suppose that is a justice of sorts, though I wonder if vengeance against the daughter truly satisfies whatever debt you believe the father owes. She looked away then, her composure cracking just slightly as she added, I know what I am to you, Mr. Ashford, a symbol of your triumph over him, a trophy to mark your superiority, and I have accepted this because I have no choice, and because perhaps I deserve no better, being his blood. The words should have satisfied Marcus, should have confirmed his righteousness and steeled his resolve, but instead he found himself profoundly shaken, the foundations of his certainty crumbling beneath the weight of her quiet acknowledgement, because in refusing to defend her father, she had stripped away his ability to see her as merely an extension of Edmund Hartley's guilt. It forced him to recognize that she was not her father's accomplice, but perhaps his victim as well, and the realization left Marcus staring across the table at his wife, with something uncomfortably close to shame beginning to kindle in his chest. The uncomfortable shame that Catherine's acknowledgement had kindled in Marcus's chest might have grown into something transformative, had circumstances allowed for gradual examination, but 3 days after their dinner conversation, he was working in his study when Mrs. Morrison appeared at his door with an expression of concern that made him set down his pen, and when she informed him that the mistress had taken ill with a fever and been confined to her chambers, Marcus felt only a flash of irritation at the disruption to the household routine before returning to his correspondence, dismissing the matter as one of those minor ailments to which women seemed particularly susceptible and which required nothing from him beyond basic courtesy. It was not until 2 days later, when he encountered the doctor leaving Catherine's wing of the house, that Marcus learned his wife's fever had broken. But that doctor, Whitmore, seemed unusually grave for what should have been good news, and when Marcus inquired more from propriety than genuine concern, the elderly physician had fixed him with a look that contained both professional discretion and personal disapproval, before saying quietly, "Your wife is recovering from this particular incident, Mr. Ashford, but I must tell you plainly that Mrs. Ashford's constitution has always been exceedingly fragile. She has suffered from weakness of the lungs since childhood, and these fevers, while they may seem minor, take a considerable toll on her overall health." The words registered but did not fully penetrate Marcus's awareness, filtered as they were through his determination to maintain emotional distance, and he nodded curtly and thanked the doctor and thought no more of it, until a week later, when rising early to review contracts before breakfast, he happened to glance out his study window and saw Catherine walking in the garden in the soft light of dawn, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill, and moving with that characteristic grace he had come to recognize, and he was about to turn away when he saw her pause beside the rose arbor and press a handkerchief to her mouth as her shoulders shook with coughing that seemed to go on far too long, the delicate violence of it visible even from this distance. Marcus found himself frozen at the window, watching as Catherine lowered the handkerchief and stood for a moment with one hand pressed to her chest, her face turned up toward the pale sky with an expression of such weariness that something twisted uncomfortably in his chest, and when she resumed her walk, he noticed what he had never bothered to observe before, the careful way she moved, as though conserving energy, the slight breathlessness that sometimes marked her speech, and the pallor that he had attributed to temperament, but which might have deeper causes entirely. "Mrs." Morrison's words came back to him then, something she had said during the wedding preparations that he had dismissed as irrelevant domestic chatter. Poor lamb, she's always been delicate. Since she was a girl, terrible lungs. You know, the doctors said she might not reach adulthood, though she's proved them wrong so far. At the time, Marcus had registered only that his revenge would be taking a more fragile form than anticipated, but now, watching Catherine cough again in the misty garden, he felt the first stirring of something that might have been concern or might have been merely the unwanted recognition that his instrument of vengeance was proving to be distressingly, inconveniently human, and the realization disturbed him more than he cared to admit. Autumn arrived with its characteristic melancholy, painting the estate grounds in shades of amber and crimson that seemed to Marcus both beautiful and accusatory, as though nature itself were reproaching him for the coldness he maintained within walls that should have held warmth. And it was during this season of transformation that he found himself engaged in a peculiar ritual whose origins he could not quite trace, leaving books in the library that he thought Catherine might enjoy, volumes of poetry or philosophy or travel narratives that he placed on the small table near the window where she often sat, never with any note or acknowledgement, never mentioned in their brief encounters, simply left there as though by accident or oversight. He told himself it meant nothing, this small gesture, that he was merely ensuring the library's resources were properly utilized, but he could not deny the quiet satisfaction he felt when he would pass by later and find the books gone, replaced eventually by others carefully returned to their proper shelves, and he noticed too that fresh flowers began appearing in his study with increasing regularity, delicate arrangements of late-blooming roses or chrysanthemums that Catherine must have cut from the garden and placed in the crystal vase. On his desk, another unspoken exchange in the careful dance they were performing around each other. The evening that everything shifted came unexpectedly, as such moments often do, when Marcus was working late in his study and noticed through the window that rain had begun falling in heavy sheets, the kind of sudden autumn downpour that turned the grounds into a watercolor blur, and he thought nothing of it until he saw a figure moving through the deluge toward the house, recognizing with a start Catherine's slight form as she hurried across the lawn carrying something clutched against her chest. He found himself moving without conscious decision, reaching the garden door just as she stumbled inside, soaked completely through, her hair plastered to her face and her dress clinging to her trembling frame, and he saw that what she had been protecting so carefully was a handful of the deep purple asters that he had once mentioned, years ago in some forgotten conversation, had been his mother's favorite flower. "I saw the rain coming," Catherine said through chattering teeth, her voice apologetic as always. "And I thought I remembered you said I didn't want them to be ruined." And Marcus felt something crack decisively in his chest as he looked at this woman who had run through a storm to save flowers for a man who had given her nothing but coldness, who stood shivering and apologizing for her own kindness. He moved to the closet without speaking, retrieved one of the heavy blankets kept there for winter drafts, and returned to where Catherine still stood, dripping on the flagstones, and when he wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, his hands brushed against hers, still clutching the bedraggled flowers, and for a moment neither of them moved, caught in that brief contact that seemed to carry all the words they had never spoken, all the tenderness that had been growing in the spaces between their silence. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, and he was not certain whether he meant for the flowers or for something larger, something he could not yet name. But Catherine's eyes met his with an expression of such gentle surprise that he knew she understood, and in that moment, standing in the dimness of the garden room with rain drumming against the windows and her hand warm beneath his own, Marcus felt the last of his certainty about revenge and justice and the righteousness of his cause begin to dissolve like morning mist, leaving behind only the terrible, wonderful recognition that Catherine Ashford was no longer a means to an end, but had become, without his permission or awareness, someone he could not imagine the house without, someone whose absence would leave a void that no satisfaction of vengeance could ever fill. The fragile peace that had been growing between Marcus and Catherine like some tender plant in uncertain soil was shattered on a grey November afternoon, when Lord Edmund Hartley arrived at the estate unannounced, his carriage rattling up the drive with an urgency that spoke of desperation rather than social courtesy, and Marcus, who had been reviewing correspondence in his study, felt his old hatred rise like bile in his throat at the sight of the man who had destroyed his family, now reduced to whatever circumstances had brought him here, seeking favor. He received Hartley in the formal drawing room with cold civility, noting with grim satisfaction the signs of financial strain in the older man's appearance, the slightly worn cuffs of his coat, the tightness around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. And when Hartley began his rehearsed speech about temporary difficulties and the obligations of family connections, Marcus felt nothing but contempt for this man who had shown his own father no such mercy. But it was the sound of footsteps in the hall that made him turn, and he saw Catherine pause in the doorway, her face draining of color at the sight of her father. "Catherine," Hartley said sharply, his tone transforming from wheedling supplication to autocratic command in an instant. "I trust you have been doing your duty and securing your husband's goodwill. God knows you've been useless for little else in your life. But surely even you can manage to make yourself agreeable enough to loosen a man's purse strings." And Marcus watched in stunned silence as Catherine stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her and her eyes downcast in an attitude of such practiced submission that he realized with sick certainty she had endured such words her entire life. The conversation that followed was brutal in its casual cruelty, Hartley alternating between berating his daughter as a failed investment, who had at least managed to secure a wealthy husband, and demanding that Marcus extend him a substantial loan. And through it all, Catherine said nothing, standing silent as a statue, while her father catalogued her inadequacies and presumed upon connections he had no right to claim, until finally, Marcus, motivated less by mercy than by the visceral disgust at watching this performance, told Hartley coldly that no funds would be forthcoming, and that his visit had concluded, and saw the older man's face twist with rage, before he turned that fury on Catherine one final time, telling her she was as worthless as her mother had been, and that she had better learn to be of some use to someone before she ended up alone and forgotten. After the carriage had departed, Marcus stood in the drawing room feeling oddly shaken, and when he went looking for Catherine, he found her finally in the conservatory among her beloved plants, sitting on the stone bench with her face in her hands and her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that she was clearly trying to suppress. And when he approached, she looked up with eyes red from weeping and immediately began to apologize, her voice breaking as she said, "Forgive me. I should not. I have no right to burden you with this." But Marcus found himself moving closer, his usual awkwardness with emotion making his words come out rough and unpolished, as he said, "You needn't apologize, Catherine, not for this, not for him." And he saw something in her expression crack open, some careful control finally breaking, and she wept, then truly, not the silent tears of earlier, but deep, shuddering sobs that seemed to come from some profound well of grief. And Marcus stood there feeling useless and angry and strangely tender all at once, and after a long moment he sat beside her on the bench and said quietly, "He is wrong about you, whatever else he may be. He is wrong about that." And Catherine looked at him with such surprised gratitude that Marcus felt something shift irrevocably in his chest, some last barrier between them, crumbling into dust. The weeks that followed Lord Hartley's visit brought a subtle but unmistakable transformation to the rhythms of the household, as though that moment of shared vulnerability in the conservatory had opened a door that neither Marcus nor Catherine had the will or desire to close again. And it began with small things, Marcus finding himself suggesting they take tea together in the afternoons, Catherine accepting with a careful pleasure that made his chest tighten with something he refused yet to name, and these tea times, initially brief and formal, gradually extended into longer conversations that ranged across subjects Marcus had never imagined discussing with her. He was surprised to discover that Catherine possessed not merely the superficial accomplishments expected of women of her class, but a genuine intellect that had been starved for engagement, and when she asked him questions about his business ventures, her observations revealed an understanding of commercial principles that many of his male associates lacked, and he found himself explaining his strategies and challenges with an enthusiasm he had not felt since his father's death, while Catherine listened with an attention that was neither flattering nor dismissive, but genuinely interested, offering occasionally a perspective that made him reconsider his assumptions. In turn, Marcus found himself asking Catherine about her music, a topic he had previously ignored, despite the beautiful melodies that drifted through the house each evening, and when she offered tentatively to play for him if he wished, he accepted with a gruffness that masked the peculiar anticipation he felt, And that evening he sat in the drawing room while Catherine positioned herself at the piano, her hands trembling slightly as they had on their wedding day, and then she began to play, and Marcus felt something in him go absolutely still, as the music filled the room, not the safe, pretty pieces he had expected, but something deeper and more complex, a Chopin nocturne that seemed to contain all the loneliness and longing he had seen in her eyes these past months, and he watched her face as she played, saw how she disappeared into the music, how her usual careful composure gave way to something raw and true, and he understood with a clarity that was almost painful that he had been deceived, but not by Catherine, by himself, by his assumptions, by his willful blindness. She was not her father, had never been her father, bore no more responsibility for Edmund Hartley's sins than Marcus's mother had borne for his father's financial misjudgments, and yet he had married her as an instrument of vengeance against a man she herself had suffered under, had condemned her to a loveless union as punishment for crimes she had not committed, and the recognition of this injustice crashed over him with the force of a wave as Catherine's fingers moved across the keys with heartbreaking grace, and when the final notes faded into silence, he found he could not speak for a long moment, and Catherine, misinterpreting his silence, began to apologize for boring him with her performance, but Marcus interrupted her roughly, saying, "No, it was you are," and then, unable to articulate the tumult in his chest, simply, "Thank you, Catherine, truly," and she looked at him with such surprised gratitude that he had to turn away, overwhelmed by the knowledge that this woman, whom he had treated with such calculated coldness, possessed a depth of soul he had never imagined, and that somewhere in the careful distance he had maintained between them, he had failed to notice when she had ceased to be a pawn in his game of revenge, and had become instead someone irreplaceable, someone whose quiet presence had begun to fill all the empty places in his wounded heart. The discovery came quite by accident on a cold December morning when Marcus, searching for a misplaced document in the small writing desk Catherine used for correspondence, came across a ledger book that seemed oddly out of place among her poetry volumes and personal letters, and curiosity, perhaps tinged with the remnants of his old suspicion, compelled him to open it, and what he found there made him sink slowly into the chair as the implications washed over him in waves of mounting astonishment. The ledger contained meticulous records of payments, all modest sums but clearly significant given Catherine's limited allowance, and beside each entry were names that Marcus recognized with a jolt of recognition: the Blackwood family, whose father had been his own father's closest associate before the bankruptcy; the Hendersons, whose son had worked in the Ashford mills; the Prices, the Thorntons, the Weavers, all families that had been tied to his father's business and had suffered when it collapsed, families Marcus himself had lost track of over the years as he focused his energies on building his own fortune and planning his revenge. Catherine had found them somehow, these scattered remnants of his father's former world, and had been sending them money for months, not from any fortune of her own, for she had none, but from the small household allowance Marcus provided her. Money she might have spent on books or music, or any of the small comforts that made her restricted life more bearable, and instead she had sought out these struggling families and had been helping them quietly, asking nothing, telling no one, recording it all in this simple ledger, with a care that spoke of genuine commitment rather than performative charity. Marcus sat there for a long time holding the ledger, feeling something profound and disorienting shifting in his understanding of the woman he had married, and when Catherine returned from her morning walk in the garden, her cheeks flushed with cold and her breath coming slightly short in a way that should have alarmed him, but that he had been willfully ignoring, she found him waiting in the drawing room with the ledger on the table between them, and her face went very pale, and still in that way he had learned meant she was bracing herself for condemnation. "Why?" Marcus asked, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, thick with emotions he could not name. "Why did you do this, Catherine? These people, how did you even find them?" And she stood there for a long moment before moving to sit across from him, her hands folded carefully in her lap in that gesture of composure he now recognized as protective armor, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, carrying a conviction that seemed to come from some deep place within her that he had never been permitted to see. "Because someone should have helped them then," she said simply, meeting his eyes with a directness that was new between them, a shedding of her usual careful deference. "I cannot undo the past, Marcus, I cannot restore what my father took from your family or from these families, but I can do this now. I can offer what small help is within my power to give." And then, softer, "They suffered for things that were not their fault, just as you suffered, just as your parents suffered, and perhaps if someone had shown such mercy to your father when he needed it most, the story might have ended differently." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, some last fortress of his hatred crumbling under the weight of her words. And he looked at this woman whom he had married as an instrument of vengeance, whom he had treated with calculated coldness while she had been quietly, persistently trying to heal the very wounds he had spent years nursing, and he understood with devastating clarity that she possessed a grace he had never imagined, a capacity for compassion that shamed his years of careful revenge. And when he spoke again, his voice was unsteady, with an emotion he could no longer deny. "You are nothing like him," he said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact that felt like both confession and absolution. Nothing at all. Christmas approached with the quiet inevitability of winter itself, and Catherine, despite the increasing pallor that Marcus tried not to notice and the way she had to pause more frequently when climbing stairs, insisted on decorating the house herself, moving through the rooms with a quiet determination that was both admirable and alarming as she hung evergreen boughs and arranged holly berries with hands that trembled slightly from fatigue rather than cold. Marcus watched her from doorways and hallway corners, wanting to tell her to rest, to let the servants handle such tasks, but something in her face as she worked a soft contentment he had rarely seen there kept him silent, and he realized with a pang that she was trying to create something beautiful in this house that had been so cold and empty for so long, trying to breathe warmth into the marble prison he had built around them both, and she asked for nothing, no grand festivities or elaborate celebrations, only permission to arrange a small gathering for the household staff on Christmas Eve, a gesture of gratitude to those who had served them faithfully, and Marcus found himself agreeing to more than he had intended, even helping her procure gifts for each member of the staff, though he did so quietly, not wanting to diminish her pleasure in the planning. The exhaustion in her face grew more pronounced as Christmas Eve arrived, shadows like bruises beneath her eyes, and twice he saw her lean against the wall as though the simple act of standing required more strength than she possessed. But when he suggested she rest, she smiled and told him she would, soon, after everything was ready. And the small celebration she had arranged was modest but genuine, the servants clearly touched by her thoughtfulness, by the personal gifts she had chosen for each of them, and the kind words she offered. And Mrs. Morrison caught Marcus's eye across the room with an expression that was equal parts approval and concern, a look that said she too had noticed Catherine's decline and wondered what he intended to do about it. After the servants had retired to their own celebrations, Catherine asked Marcus to join her in the drawing room, and she moved to the small table near the window where a single wrapped package waited, and when she handed it to him her hands shook so badly that he had to steady them with his own, and his heart clenched at how fragile she felt, how delicate her bones seemed beneath his fingers. "I wanted to give you something," she said softly, and there was something in her voice, a finality perhaps, or simply a desperate hope that this gesture might bridge the vast distance that still remained between them. And Marcus unwrapped the package with careful hands to find a photograph in an ornate frame, and for a moment he could not comprehend what he was seeing because it was impossible. It was a photograph of his parents, his mother and father together before the ruin, before the despair, his father's hand on his mother's shoulder, and both of them smiling with a happiness Marcus had almost forgotten they had once possessed. And he stared at it with a throat gone tight and eyes that burned, because he had thought all such photographs lost or destroyed in the years after his father's death. And he looked at Catherine, who was watching him with anxious hope, and he managed to ask, his voice rough and broken, where did you find this?" And she explained, haltingly, that she had asked Mrs. Morrison if any of the old staff from his father's household still lived nearby, and had tracked down his parents' former housekeeper, who had kept this photograph all these years, and Catherine had paid to have it cleaned and restored and framed, had done all of this in secret over the past months, while he had been so carefully maintaining his distance, and Marcus felt something break apart in his chest, all the careful walls he had built, crumbling under the weight of this impossible kindness, this gift that represented not wealth or obligation, but a depth of understanding and compassion that undid him completely. And he looked at Catherine's pale, anxious face and could not find words adequate to express what he felt, could only pull her gently into his arms for the first time since their wedding day, and hold her as she trembled against him, and whisper into her hair, "Thank you, Catherine, thank you," while his tears fell silent and unrestrained onto her dark hair, and she held him too, her arms around him fragile but sure, and neither of them spoke of how her breathing was labored or how she swayed slightly with exhaustion, because in that moment they both understood that something had shifted irrevocably between them, that whatever distance remained was no longer a wall but simply space that needed crossing. And Marcus made a silent vow as he held his wife in his arms that he would spend whatever time remained proving to her that she was not unloved, that she had never been the thing he had once imagined, but had become instead the most precious thing in his wounded world. January descended upon the estate with a cruelty that seemed deliberate, bringing with it winds that howled through the eaves, and a cold so penetrating that no fire could quite banish it from the rooms, and Catherine's cough, which had been merely concerning in the weeks following Christmas, transformed into something far more ominous, a deep rattling sound that seemed to come from the very center of her chest and left her breathless and trembling after each fit, and Marcus watched with mounting alarm as she grew paler and thinner despite Mrs. Morrison's best efforts with nourishing broths and warm compresses, until finally one grey afternoon in the third week of January, Catherine collapsed in the hallway outside the library, crumpling to the floor so suddenly that Marcus, who had been passing nearby, barely caught her before her head struck the marble, and the lightness of her in his arms terrified him more than her unconsciousness, as though she were already fading into something insubstantial, already slipping away from the world of solid things. The doctor arrived within the hour, a grave-faced man named Dr. Pemberton, who had tended to consumption cases for 30 years and recognized its signs with the weary certainty of long experience. And after his examination, he requested to speak with Marcus privately in the study, and the way he closed the door with careful deliberation told Marcus everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken. And when Dr. Pemberton finally said, with the clinical gentleness of one delivering a death sentence, "I'm afraid it's consumption, Mr. Ashford, quite advanced. She's likely been suffering with it for some time, perhaps years, and the stress and exertion of recent months have accelerated its progression considerably." Marcus felt the room tilt and spin, as though the very foundations of his world were coming loose, and he had to grip the edge of his desk to steady himself as the doctor continued. "I would estimate she has perhaps 2 or 3 months remaining, possibly less if the winter continues this harsh. I'm sorry. There's very little to be done at this stage beyond keeping her comfortable and ensuring she rests as much as possible." Marcus heard himself asking questions in a voice that sounded distant and mechanical, asking about treatments and specialists and whether a change of climate might help, and Dr. Pemberton answered with patient kindness that yes, such things could be attempted, but would likely only prolong the inevitable by weeks rather than months. And after the doctor left, Marcus stood alone in his study and felt the full weight of what he had done crash down upon him with devastating force. Because he loved her, God help him, he loved Catherine with a fierceness that shocked him in its intensity, loved her quiet grace and her gentle compassion, and the way she had transformed his cold house into something almost resembling a home, loved her for the kindness she had shown to people she had never met simply because it was right, loved her for the way she played Chopin in the evenings and left flowers in his study and had given him back the image of his parents' happiness. And he had wasted so much time, had spent months locked in his fortress of revenge and pride, while she had been dying by degrees in the rooms around him. And now, when he finally understood what she meant to him, when he was finally ready to lay down his hatred and reach for something better, it was too late. Too late for all the words he had never said, too late for the tenderness he had withheld, too late for the life they might have built together if he had not been so determined to punish her for sins that were never hers. And Marcus sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands, and wept for the first time since his father's funeral, wept for Catherine and for himself, and for all the wasted days that could never be reclaimed. Marcus became a man possessed by desperate purpose in the days following Dr. Pemberton's devastating diagnosis, throwing himself into a frenzied search for anything that might save Catherine, or at least grant her more time. And he summoned specialists from London and Edinburgh, Physicians who examined her with grave faces and offered cautiously worded opinions that amounted to the same terrible conclusion, though he paid them exorbitant fees to try experimental treatments anyway, anything that might offer even the slimmest thread of hope. And he researched sanatoriums in Switzerland, where the mountain air was said to work miracles for consumptive patients, began making arrangements to transport Catherine there, despite the difficulties of such a journey in her weakened state. And through it all, Catherine watched his sudden attentiveness with an expression that was equal parts confusion and tentative gratitude, as though she could not quite comprehend why he had transformed so abruptly from distant husband to devoted caretaker. And one afternoon, when he brought her yet another tonic recommended by yet another specialist, she reached for his hand with fingers that trembled from weakness and said softly, "Marcus, you have been so kind to me these past weeks, kinder than I ever deserved or expected, and I want you to know that I am grateful, truly grateful, for your care." And the words struck him like physical blows because she still did not understand, still believed herself unworthy of basic human compassion, still thought his desperate efforts were merely the discharge of husbandly duty rather than the actions of a man terrified of losing the woman he loved. And he wanted to shout at her that she deserved everything, deserved all the kindness and tenderness and devotion he had failed to give her during the months of their marriage, deserved a husband who had cherished her from the beginning rather than one who had married her as an instrument of revenge. But the words caught in his throat, and he could only squeeze her hand gently and tell her to rest, to save her strength for the journey to Switzerland they would undertake as soon as she was stable enough to travel. The specialists came and went with their mercury treatments and their tonics and their carefully measured doses of laudanum to ease her coughing fits, and Marcus sat through their consultations with clenched jaw and desperate hope, and at night he would stand outside her bedroom door, listening to the terrible sound of her labored breathing, and wonder how he had been such a fool, how he had wasted so many precious months in stubborn pride when he could have been learning to love her openly instead of fighting against the inevitable pull of her gentle spirit. And one evening, when he brought her supper on a tray because she was too weak to come downstairs, she asked him with heartbreaking hesitancy, "Marcus, do you think that is, if circumstances had been different, if I had not been so sickly and you had not been burdened with such an unwanted wife, do you think we might have been friends in time?" And Marcus felt something shatter inside his chest at the question, at the terrible smallness of what she allowed herself to hope for, friendship, when he wanted to give her everything, wanted to turn back time and court her properly and build with her the kind of marriage that was founded on mutual respect and growing affection rather than cold contracts and colder silences. And he set down the tray with shaking hands and told her, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, "Catherine, you have never been unwanted, never been a burden. The fault has always been mine, my blindness, my cruelty of neglect." But she smiled at him with sad disbelief, as though he were simply being kind to a dying woman, and he realized with despair that he had left his confession too late, that she would never believe him now, would die thinking herself merely tolerated rather than desperately loved. Marcus began keeping vigil at Catherine's bedside each night after the household had retired, positioning his chair close enough that he could reach out and take her hand whenever the fear of losing her became too overwhelming to bear alone. And in those dark hours, when the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and Catherine's labored breathing, he would hold her hand and speak to her in whispers, telling her all the things he had been too proud and too foolish to say when she might have heard them with waking ears, and the words poured from him like a confession to a priest, though the absolution he sought was one he knew he did not deserve and likely would never receive. He told her about his father's ruin and his mother's grief, about the years he had spent building his fortune with the single-minded purpose of destroying Edmund Hartley, about how he had seen her as nothing more than a convenient tool for his revenge, a way to humiliate her father by trapping his daughter in a loveless marriage, and the shame of speaking these truths aloud made his voice shake and break. But he forced himself to continue because she deserved to know, deserved to understand why he had been so cold to her in those early months, why he had denied himself the gift of knowing her when she had been there all along waiting with patient grace for whatever small kindnesses he might offer. He confessed how the thaw had begun so gradually he had not recognized it for what it was, how her quiet presence in his library had first irritated him and then intrigued him, how her refusal to defend her father had forced him to see her as separate from the man whose crimes had shaped Marcus's entire adult life. And he told her about the moment in the conservatory when he had found her crying, and had realized with terrible clarity that she had suffered under Edmund Hartley's cruelty far longer than Marcus himself had, that she bore scars Marcus could not see, and how that realization had begun to crack the foundations of his carefully constructed hatred. He spoke of autumn evenings watching her arrange flowers, of finding the restored photograph of his parents on Christmas Eve, and understanding that she had given him back something precious he thought lost forever, of the dawning horror, when Dr. Pemberton had pronounced her sentence, and Marcus had finally been forced to acknowledge what his heart had been trying to tell him for weeks, that he loved her with a depth and fierceness that terrified him, because it made him vulnerable in ways his revenge had never prepared him for. And now she was slipping away, and all his wealth and power could not save her, could not buy back the time he had wasted, or undo the loneliness he had inflicted upon her through his deliberate neglect. Catherine stirred occasionally during these whispered confessions, her eyelids fluttering and her fingers tightening weakly around his, and once she murmured something that might have been his name, and Marcus leaned closer, his heart hammering with desperate hope. But she did not wake, simply settled back into her fitful sleep, and he was left wondering whether she had heard any of it, or whether his words had been nothing more than the unburdening of his own tormented conscience, speaking truths into the darkness that would die with her unacknowledged, and the thought that she might leave this world, never knowing that she had been loved, truly and desperately loved, filled him with an anguish so profound that some nights he pressed his forehead against their joined hands and wept silently, mourning not just for her impending death, but for all the wasted days of their marriage. For every moment he had chosen pride over tenderness, silence over connection, and revenge over the possibility of love. February arrived with bitter winds that rattled the windows of the estate and seemed to carry with them a premonition of endings, and Catherine grew steadily weaker, despite all of Marcus's desperate efforts and the ministrations of the specialists he continued to summon, though even he could see the futility written in their carefully neutral expressions, and her fever came and went in waves that left her sometimes lucid and sometimes lost in delirium, speaking to people who were not there, or reliving moments from a childhood Marcus had never asked her about, and now would never have the chance to know, and he maintained his vigil with growing desperation, holding her hand through the worst of the fever spells and wiping her brow with cool cloths when she burned hot enough that he feared she might simply consume herself from within. And on one particular evening, when the February darkness came early and heavy, Catherine drifted in that twilight state, between waking and sleeping, her breathing shallow and labored, her skin nearly translucent in the lamplight, and Marcus sat beside her as he had every night for weeks, holding her hand and watching the too rapid flutter of her pulse at her throat, when suddenly her eyes opened, though they seemed to focus on something beyond him, beyond the room itself, and her lips moved soundlessly at first, before the words came out in a whisper so faint he had to lean closer to hear them. "I love you, Marcus," she said, and each word seemed to cost her precious strength she could not spare, and tears slipped from the corners of her eyes as she continued. "I'm sorry I wasn't enough to make you love me. I tried to be what you needed, tried to stay out of your way, tried not to be a burden, but I failed at even that, didn't I? But I want you to know, before I go, that I'm grateful for the small kindnesses you gave me these last months, for the books you left in the library though you never said they were from you, for the blanket that night in the rain, for sitting with me now when you could be anywhere else, and I'm sorry I'm leaving you with this trouble. Sorry. You had to be saddled with a dying wife when you deserved so much more from this marriage you never wanted." And the words broke something fundamental in Marcus's chest, shattered the last fragments of the walls he had built around his heart, because she thought she was confessing her love unheard, thought she was apologizing for the crime of dying to a husband who had never loved her, thought the kindnesses he had shown her were mere duty rather than the inadequate expressions of a love he had been too proud and too foolish to name. And he gripped her hand tighter and leaned down until his face was close to hers, his voice raw and breaking as he said, "Catherine, I love you, God help me. I love you so desperately it terrifies me, and you were always enough, always more than enough. The fault was mine for being too blind to see it, too consumed by old hatred to recognize the gift I had been given." And he told her again and again that he loved her, that she had transformed him without even trying, that every moment of their marriage he had wasted in cold silence was a moment he would regret for the rest of his life, however long or short that might be. But Catherine only smiled at him with heartbreaking tenderness, her eyes already drifting closed again, and she whispered, "What a beautiful dream to die with." Because she thought his confession was nothing more than fever-born delusion, a kind fiction her dying mind had created to ease her passage from this world, and she believed herself unloved still, even as Marcus wept openly beside her and pressed her hand to his lips and begged her to believe him and to stay with him, to give him the chance to prove that his love was real and true, and entirely too late. Marcus refused to accept the doctor's grim pronouncement that Catherine had only days remaining, refused to let her slip away into that final darkness, believing herself unloved and unworthy, and in an act born of equal parts desperation and devotion, he dismissed the nurse. Dr. Pemberton had recommended and moved Catherine from her sick room into his own bedchamber, carrying her himself, despite her weightless frailty, and settling her among the pillows of the bed where he had slept alone for all the months of their marriage. And from that night forward he never left her side except when absolutely necessary, maintaining a vigil that the household staff watched with amazement and something like awe, for they had never seen their master like this, stripped of his cold reserve and laid bare by a love that had come too late, but burned no less fiercely for its tardiness. And through the long February nights Marcus held Catherine against his chest, her back curved into the shelter of his body, his arms wrapped carefully around her fragile form, and he read to her from the poetry books she loved, his voice hoarse from hours of speaking but never stopping, never surrendering to the silence that might let death creep closer. And when he was too exhausted to read, he simply talked to her, spinning stories of the future he was determined they would share, describing in vivid detail the places they would travel when she was well, the gardens they would plant together come spring, the quiet evenings they would spend in the library with her reading aloud while he pretended to work but really just listened to the music of her voice. And he painted pictures with his words of lazy summer afternoons and winter nights by the fire, and all the ordinary precious moments that made up a life lived in love rather than in the cold pursuit of revenge. And though Catherine was too weak to respond with more than the occasional flutter of her eyelids or the faint pressure of her fingers against his hand, Marcus saw that her eyes followed him when he moved about the room, saw the way her breathing sometimes steadied when he spoke to her, and he clung to these small signs as a drowning man clings to driftwood, desperate for any evidence that she was still fighting, still holding on to the fragile thread that bound her to this world and to him. And once, in the deep hours of night when the fire had burned low and the room was filled with shadows, Catherine's lips moved soundlessly and Marcus leaned close to hear, and she shaped a single word with such effort that it clearly cost her dearly. Stay. And his heart broke anew even as it filled with a fierce determination, and he pressed his lips to her temple and whispered against her skin, "Always, Catherine, I will always stay. I promise you on everything I hold sacred that I will be here when you wake, and here when you sleep, and here for every moment in between. You will never be alone again, never unloved again. I swear it." And Dr. Pemberton came each day and examined her with increasingly grave expressions, his professional demeanor cracking slightly when he took Marcus aside and said gently that he should prepare himself, that it was truly only a matter of days now, perhaps hours, that Marcus should summon a priest if Catherine had any final wishes to express. But Marcus thanked him coldly and returned to Catherine's side and gathered her close and continued his vigil of hope against hope, refusing to prepare for her death, preparing instead with stubborn faith for her life. Spring arrived unexpectedly early that year, as though nature itself had decided to defy the grim pronouncements of physicians and the seeming inevitability of death. And one morning in early March, Marcus woke from an exhausted sleep, still holding Catherine in his arms, to find that her skin no longer burned with the terrible fever that had consumed her for weeks, and when he pressed his hand to her forehead in disbelief, he found it cool and slightly damp, with the sweat of a fever finally broken, and her breathing, though still shallow and weak, had lost that terrible rattling quality that had haunted his nightmares. And he lay there hardly daring to move, hardly daring to hope, watching her face in the pale dawn light that filtered through the curtains, And after what seemed like hours, her eyelids fluttered and then opened, and for the first time in weeks her gaze was clear and focused, truly seeing him rather than looking through him at fever visions only she could perceive. And Catherine blinked, slowly, as though trying to reconcile the world she was waking to with the world she had expected to leave behind. And then her eyes settled on Marcus's face and widened slightly with something that might have been wonder or confusion, or perhaps simply recognition, and she lifted one trembling hand from where it lay against his chest and touched his face with fingers so light they felt like butterfly wings against his unshaven cheek. And her lips moved soundlessly at first before the words emerged in a whisper so faint he had to strain to hear them. "You stayed," she said, and the simple statement carried with it such depths of amazement and gratitude that Marcus felt his throat constrict with emotion. And he caught her hand where it rested against his face and pressed it there, holding it gently as though it were made of spun glass. And he said with a voice made rough by weeks of reading and talking and pleading with God and fate and any power that might be listening, "I'll always stay, Catherine, I promised you that, and I am a man who keeps his promises, however late I may be in making them." And he kissed her palm and then her wrist, where her pulse fluttered like a captured bird, and Catherine's eyes filled with tears that spilled over and tracked down her temples into her hair. But they were not tears of sorrow now, but rather of something Marcus barely recognized, because he had seen it so rarely in their short marriage. They were tears of hope, of dawning belief that perhaps she had not dreamed his confessions of love after all, that perhaps she was not destined to die unloved and unworthy, as she had always believed herself to be. And she whispered, "I thought it was a dream. I thought my mind was being kind to me at the end, but you're here, you're real, and you're still here." And Marcus gathered her more closely against him, careful of her fragility but unable to resist the need to hold her, and he said against her hair, "I'm here, and you're here, and against all reason and expectation you're still here, and I will spend every day that remains to us proving to you that my love is real and true and entirely yours." And Dr. Pemberton, when he arrived later that morning and examined Catherine with undisguised astonishment, declared it the most remarkable recovery he had ever witnessed, though he cautioned that she was far from well and would require months of careful rest and gradual rebuilding of her strength. But Marcus barely heard these warnings, because Catherine was alive and lucid and beginning, slowly and tentatively, to heal. And that was miracle enough for any man who had prepared himself for grief and been granted instead the precious gift of hope. The months that followed Catherine's miraculous recovery were marked by a gentleness that neither of them had known was possible, a slow and careful rebuilding of not just her health, but of the marriage that had been founded on such cold and bitter ground. And at Marcus's insistence, they left the grand estate for a smaller property in the countryside, where the air was cleaner and the pace of life moved with the seasons rather than with the relentless march of industry and ambition, and there in that sun-filled house with gardens that stretched down to a quiet stream, Catherine grew stronger week by week, the color returning to her cheeks and the lightness to her step, though she tired easily still, and Marcus watched her with an anxiety he could not entirely suppress, terrified that this reprieve was temporary and that death might yet claim the woman he had so nearly lost. But as spring deepened into summer and summer mellowed into autumn, Catherine continued to improve, and more remarkably still, they began to truly know each other for the first time, sitting together in the garden, where they would read aloud from books they had chosen together, or walking along the stream in the early evening, when the light turned everything golden, and Catherine would pause to identify the songs of different birds, while Marcus learned to see the world through her eyes, noticing beauties he had been blind to in his years of cold calculation and revenge. And they talked now in ways they never had before, Catherine asking him about his childhood before tragedy had hardened him, and Marcus finding himself able to speak of his parents without the consuming bitterness that had defined him for so long, and she told him of her own lonely upbringing in her father's house, where she had been merely another asset to be managed and eventually disposed of. And in these exchanges, they discovered that they had both been prisoners of Lord Hartley's cruelty in different ways, and this shared understanding became a bridge between them stronger than passion alone could have built. Yet there remained in Catherine a lingering uncertainty that Marcus could see in her eyes when she thought he was not watching, a question she was afraid to ask until one evening in late autumn when they sat before the fire, and she said quietly, almost desperately, "Marcus, tell me true, do you love me? Or is this merely guilt for the harm you intended, pity for the invalid I became?" And he looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had shown him grace when he deserved none, who had loved him when he had given her no reason to, who had nearly died believing herself unworthy of love while teaching him what love truly meant. And he crossed to where she sat and knelt before her and took her hands in his and said, "Catherine, I could show you the books where I have written your name in the margins because I was thinking of you when I read them, or the sketches I have made of you sleeping because I wanted to capture the peace in your face, or tell you that every morning I wake grateful that you are still here beside me. But I think you need something more tangible than words from a man who was once so very good at lying to himself." And over the weeks that followed, he showed her through patient tenderness and unwavering presence, and the way his eyes followed her across every room, and the way he reached for her hand without thinking, and the way he listened when she spoke as though every word she uttered was precious. And Catherine watched and wondered and slowly began to believe, until one evening when they walked together in the garden, and she turned to him suddenly and kissed him, truly kissed him for the first time as his wife, rather than as his obligation, and when she pulled back, she whispered against his lips, "I believe you now, Marcus. I believe you love me." And he held her close, and thought of all the time they had wasted, and all the time they had been granted, and knew himself blessed beyond all deserving. 3 years had passed since that terrible winter when death had reached for Catherine and been denied, and the world Marcus inhabited now bore almost no resemblance to the cold and vengeful existence he had constructed in the years before he met her. For the estate, they had returned to the grand house that had once been a marble prison, was transformed utterly, filled now with warmth and laughter and the chaotic joy of life truly lived. And on this particular spring afternoon, Marcus stood at the window of his study, watching the garden below where Catherine moved among the flower beds with their daughter Eleanor, a child of 2 years with her mother's gentle eyes and her father's dark hair. And Catherine was healthy now, truly healthy, with color in her cheeks and strength in her step, and a radiance that seemed to emanate from some inexhaustible source within her. And she bent to show Eleanor a butterfly that had landed on a rose bloom, and the child's delighted squeal carried up to where Marcus stood, transfixed by the simple beauty of this moment. And he thought of the night he had believed he would lose her, the night when her whispered confession of love had shattered every wall he had built around his heart. And he thought of all the years he had wasted nursing hatred for a man who deserved it, while planning a revenge that would have destroyed the only person who had ever shown him what love truly meant. And the distance between who he had been then and who he had become now seemed vast and unbridgeable, except for Catherine's grace. And she looked up suddenly as though sensing his gaze, and smiled at him and waved, and Eleanor imitated her mother's gesture with chubby enthusiasm. And Marcus felt his heart constrict with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful, and he descended the stairs and went out into the garden where Catherine met him with a kiss, and Eleanor demanded to be lifted into his arms, and he held his daughter, while Catherine slipped her hand into his free one, and they stood together in the sunlight, surrounded by flowers and birdsong, and the evidence of the life they had built from the ashes of revenge and regret. And Marcus knew himself blessed beyond all deserving by a woman who had loved him when he had given her every reason not to, who had forgiven him though he had never asked forgiveness, who had saved him without ever knowing she was doing so. And dear listener, sometimes the heart we seek to break becomes the one that saves us, and the revenge we plan with such cold determination becomes the very thing that reveals our own need for redemption. For Marcus learned what many of us must learn in our own time and our own way, that love asks more courage than hatred ever could, that transformation is possible even for those who believe themselves beyond saving, that the grace we least deserve is often the grace we most desperately need. And if you have known the weight of old anger or the burden of planned cruelty, know that it is never too late to choose differently, to let love break through the walls you have built, to allow yourself to be saved by the very person you thought you would use and discard. For in the end we are all capable of both terrible coldness and extraordinary warmth, and the choice between them is ours to make each day. And may you find the courage to choose love over revenge, vulnerability over armor, forgiveness over grudges, and may you know the peace that comes when you finally lay down the weapons you have carried for so long and allow yourself to be truly known and truly loved. and may your nights be gentle, and your days be filled with the small mercies that accumulate into grace. Brought to you with hope and reflection by Love's Own Tale, where every story reminds us that the heart's capacity for transformation is infinite, and that love, patient and persistent, can redeem even the most carefully constructed revenge.